Hello, welcome to History in Lowell. I'm Maritza Grooms, joined by my personal professor and buddy, Bob Forrant. How are you doing, Bob?
I'm well, and how about you?
I'm doing all right, trying to stay sane with the collapse of the society around us.
Yep. We just keep fighting the good fight. That's all we can do.
That's all we can do, and that's part of what this show is all about.
Yep.
We fight the good fight by informing people about what's happened before, because you can't make change for the future if you don't know what's come from the past.
I'd like to think that as a history teacher. Sometimes I wonder, but...
Exactly. I like to always think about the quote that's like, if you know better, you do better. And there are some people who just don't know, right? And so hopefully we can help people know better, and so that we can do better and band together as a community.
We shall see.
And that's what today's episode is all about,
Yes.
right? Hopefully. It's eerily relevant to the landscape of today. And when, people in power spew their own rhetoric, what happens and how it trickles down. It's funny because money doesn't trickle down, but hate certainly does.
Yes, hate does, sadly.
So set the scene for us, Bob. We're going back to the 70s.
So our trip today is the 70s and 80s, 1970s, 1980s in Lowell. But just for a really quick historical context, in the 1950s, there's a landmark Supreme Court case that rules that segregated schools are unconstitutional. It's the very famous Brown v. Board of Education, which is settled in 1954, and it says it's overturning a case from even further back, 1890, late 1890s, that essentially called Plessy versus Ferguson, if anybody out there wants to look it up. But anyway, the gist of that case was it's okay to segregate as long as everybody has equal stuff. So this was the 1898 case was trains, and the idea was that there would be segregated passenger trains, particularly in the South, and that it would be okay to have black people on one car and white people on another, so long as the cars were equal. The point of it is the cars were never equal, obviously. And then in the 1950s, that is tested with what becomes the Montgomery bus boycott. This is significant involvement of a woman by the name of Rosa Parks. Hopefully people watching have heard of her before, but surprisingly, it's incredible how many people have not. Anyway, Rosa Parks is in a group that's organizing to try to desegregate bus transportation in Montgomery, Alabama, and she gets on a bus that's a segregated bus, and that means white people sit in the front of the bus, black people sit in the back of the bus. And she gets on the bus and sits in the front. And the bus driver says, "You have to move." And she says, "I'm not moving." And then he says, "You have to move." "I'm not moving." "You have to move or I'm calling the police." Says, "Be my guest." And she gets arrested. And that starts kept saying Montgomery. It's not. It's Birmingham. It starts the Birmingham bus boycott. Bad on me to become. I'm thinking of like too many things at once here.
Yeah.
It's the Birmingham bus boycott. And there's, for several months, black people and their supporters in Birmingham basically refused to ride the buses. And to try to weaken economically the bus system so that they eventually give in. It's long and protracted. The city doesn't really give in, kind of half-heartedly does. And then we switch to schools. And so why the detour? Because the Brown v. Board of Education, and then in 1964 and in 1965, Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and then in the later 1960s, there's the Education Act. All of these things collectively essentially say separate but equal is unconstitutional.
Right.
Now we get to Lowell.
Wow. Oh, I love when you set a scene, Bob. You're one of my favorite storytellers. And it really it digs into how I always say, like, whatever's happening in Lowell, you can bet it's happening or has just happened or is about to happen on the national stage.
Yep. And vice versa.
Exactly.
And vice versa. And so in the 1970s, the demographics, the population, the people living in the city of Lowell begin to change. And we go, starting in the early 1970s to where we are today, 2020 census, Lowell is a majority non-white city. in terms of the people who live in the city. That change starts happening in the 1970s. And that is what creates the situation in the schools that requires the schools, if they're going to be proactive, starting in the early 1970s, to change the way kids are assigned to schools all over the city. Lowell, like every other city, it's not unique to Lowell, but I was living in Holyoke at the time in Western Massachusetts, same situation. As the population's changing, Lowell is getting a dramatic increase in Brazilian immigrants, in Colombian immigrants, and in Dominican immigrants, and also in people coming from Puerto Rico who are not immigrants. They have citizenship as being residents of Puerto Rico. But when they come here and they settle in Lowell, they're usually their primary language is Spanish. Right. So while the Brazilians are speaking Portuguese, this other population is speaking Spanish. And in Lowell, because of long sort of set segregation in where people live and who will rent to whom and who will sell to whom, most of that influx of people ends up living in the Acre neighborhood and in a portion of what Lowellians refer to as the back central neighborhood.
Right.
And so you can see where this is going in that now you have like this greater population by multiples which have children, and they all end up going to the same schools, and those schools quickly become overcrowded.
Right.
And so by the mid 1970s, parents of those children are putting demands on the school department to do a better job educating their children. So for people out there in television land listening, sort of keep the timeline here in mind, because we're talking about parents in the 1973, 1974. This tale is not going to end until late 1989.
Right.
And so keep that in mind as we explore what's going to happen here.
Yeah, so we're dealing right now in the 70s with a largely Spanish-speaking population, some Portuguese-speaking, and there are some Black folks too who are involved in this too, because they live in some of the
same neighborhoods.
Same neighborhoods, right? And we know that schools are based on their districts, and their districts are based on the supplies and resources that schools get are often based on the taxes of the properties around them. So that's already an inequitable situation.
Right, and the schools in the downtown, in the back central neighborhood, and the Acre are, for the most part, the older schools in the system. They're schools that have been around, since the 1920s, 19-teens. If you're living in Pawtucketville, or you're living, say, over near me in Centerville, the schools are becoming a bit more up to date. But the big issue is the overcrowding. And the second issue that parents bring forward is that there aren't any people in those school buildings that look like their kids and that speak their kids' languages. And so there's nobody there that gets the kids and gets their circumstances, good and bad, gets their culture, gets their language, gets their food, their music, and makes the school a more welcoming place when all that's there.
And it's not crazy to have those things.
No, not crazy. Not crazy.
Like,
not
these are
crazy.
social determinants of health, that's all.
Yep.
For, not just for people, but for society.
Yeah, no, this is not a weird thing. And so eventually the State Board of Education comes into Lowell, comes into Holyoke, where I mentioned I was living at the time, and other places in the Commonwealth to look at what's happening in the schools. Because it's apparent that the demographics of the Commonwealth are changing. And they come to Lowell and they basically say, Lowell, this is 77, 78, Lowell is doing an inadequate job educating these kids. And it needs, basically, in so many words, it says, step up your game. They come back a year and a half later, gee, what a surprise, they have not stepped up their game. And so now the State Board of Higher Ed threatens to take money away and to do other things if the schools don't begin to dramatically change. And so now, I think half-heartedly from all the research I've done, they dabble at the edges of making change. But the school committee in particular is pretty much against changing the concept that has run the schools for decades and decades of neighborhood schools.
Even though we know that change is better when we can accommodate more kids, and there are more kids in these schools,
Yep.
and it's just growing.
Yep, and right, and then what happens is by 82, 83, so nothing much changes. There are feeble attempts at doing things, and I've read these reports of this from the state, exchanges of letters between the Lowell school superintendents at the time, and we're trying. But then comes an even greater influx of people who are coming as refugees from the end of the U.S. wars in Southeast Asia. And so there are significant numbers of people coming from Vietnam first, and then Cambodia and Laos.
Right.
And so by the early 1980s, the schools are even more crowded.
And this is also another group that has various languages
Yep.
that they speak.
At least three different languages,
Right.
and in some cases dialects. And as was the case with there not being anybody in the schools reflective of who these young people are who are coming into the schools, same thing in terms of what's happening in the schools. And a lot of the kids that are coming now from these countries in Southeast Asia are coming with a variety of problems associated with conflict and terror and everything associated with what happened in the genocide in Cambodia. In many cases, they've lived in a refugee camp for maybe the first 4 or 5 years of their life. This magnifies the problem still further. And now again, 1974, now it's 1984. So if you were a parent in 1974 worrying about your child in first grade, your child is now in 8th or 9th grade,
Right.
and nothing appreciable has changed.
Oh my, and who knows how far behind your kid is, and not because they're not able to learn,
Right.
but because there's nothing there
Yep.
for them. So, and then on top of that, the conditions in the schools are ridiculous because kids are not, it's overcrowded.
Yep.
But not just overcrowded in the ways that classrooms are backed up. These kids are spilling out.
Yep, everything's overcrowded to the point where I went back and read a number of Lowell Sun articles where reporters went in and looked at all of this like in 86, 87 and wrote these sort of expose type articles about classrooms and what had been teachers' lounges, classrooms and what had been bathrooms, kids not even coming to school, they're being sent to the YMCA or the Boys and Girls Club. Not necessarily anything wrong with either one of those institutions per se, but they're not schools.
Right.
And the kids realize and know they're not in a school where other kids are. So what, sort of symbolically, what's that telling them?
Yeah.
And so now the federal government is become aware, and the federal government has control over what are called Title I funds. Easy for me to say, Title I funds. This money that the federal government gives, especially to cities that are struggling economically, like Lowell was at the time, or cities with high concentrations of people living at or just below the poverty line, sort of ways to provide more resources for the schools. And again, it's really weird. I talked to my class about this the other day, and I said, it's ironic that the threat, because we were talking about this in class, I said, it's ironic that the threat of what to do is to take money away, which would only make the situation worse.
Yeah.
It's a very strict, we had an interesting conversation about what else could you do? I was saying, okay, and you're policymakers now, what would be some of the alternatives? What could we what could we do in between? And we were also talking about Boston, because Boston in the 70s went through the very same thing that I'm describing for Lowell in the 80s. In the 1970s, the Boston schools were in turmoil over this very thing.
Right.
And in the end, the Boston schools had to change. So what's frustrating about this is the people primarily on the school committee, I think that by the mid-'80s, the school department wanted to do the right thing, but the school committee made it very difficult, because in terms of changing where kids went to school and things like that, that had to come from the school committee. The school department could recommend, but the school committee also had control over the budget, and they could decide where the money would go. And so, so this is dragging on and dragging on and dragging on.
And there are some serious ramifications that happen because of this. I mean, imagine that you're a young person and you're hearing this, you know, or at least you're witnessing this, and you have no idea what schools are like in other places. You don't know that this is not normal, this is not okay, but maybe kids in the neighborhood will tell you what they have or what they should have. And there are parents, of course, who are fighting on your behalf, and they're angry. These parents are angry.
Yep.
So they do some stuff on behalf of their young people.
Yeah, so by 1986, parents, what's really important in the story is that what had at one point been these sort of separate communities, like Southeast Asian parents, guardians, grandmas, aunties, and the same within this population we were talking about earlier in the show, they're sort of working they're not necessarily working together, but they're working on the same issue.
Right.
And eventually people realize, okay, if we get together, maybe we're going to have more success. And in the process of doing that, they're able to get legal help from organizations, attorneys organizations in Boston, who are particularly interested in this question of schools and school segregation and equal access to quality education. And so lawyers come forward to Lowell and basically say they will work with parents and represent them in potentially filing a lawsuit against the city, but at the same time they also say, you don't need to pay us.
Wow.
We will do this with you.
Wow.
And they also know if they win, they're probably, the lawyers, they're going to be able to get their legal fees from the city.
Yeah.
Because the courts will most likely rule. And they know, I mean, the lawyers know they'll win. The law, as I laid it out earlier, is on the side of the parents.
Yeah.
And so the parents threaten a lawsuit. The state comes in, has a couple of hearings in spring of 1987. The parents group there's this famous confrontation where this coalition of parents now, with their attorneys, go to a big school committee meeting in like April or May of 1987. And they bring translators because the parents want to speak on behalf of their children, but not all of them are confident in standing up in a meeting like that and speaking in English, which makes perfect sense to me. They want translators, and the head of the school committee, whose parents are Greek immigrants, George Kolharis, he's the chair of the school committee, and he basically says, stop, we're not having translators. This is America, learn English. And basically walks out of the room. Eventually he comes back, and the school committee votes on whether or not to proceed with translators speaking on behalf of parents, and the vote splits 4-4. So there's no meeting.
Of course.
And parents leave. There's some angry words expressed in the hallway. The Lowell newspapers cover it pretty well. Kolharis gets into a shouting match with a couple of the parents of Spanish-speaking kids.
Wow.
And
so he'll shout with them, but he won't engage with
yeah,
them.
and so there's a demonstration a few days later in front of City Hall demanding that Kolharis resign from the school committee, which he does not do. Eventually, in June, the school committee votes to begin some kind of a modified procedure to move some kids around the city to, over time, desegregate the schools. but it's unclear like how quickly, how widespread. It's somewhat vague, but it's a step.
Right.
And at that point, the parents decide to file the federal lawsuit, even though this step has been made, because again, it's 1974, 3, it's now 1987. And again, if you have a child in first grade in 1974, and now it's 1987, they're nearly done their public school life in the city of Lowell, and there's been no appreciable change. And so the lawsuit gets filed, and basically using Brown v. Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act, the parents sue the city and the school committee. Successfully, eventually. Successfully, eventually. And so in the fall of 1987, when school starts, this modified busing begins. And it doesn't work really well because the buses are often late. The whole process, they rush to try to do it after they've not done anything for all this time. And the rollout to it is not quite satisfactory. Sometimes buses don't show up. And on a day in mid-September in 1987, as this is now in the second or third week, bus doesn't show up over in the neighborhood, in the acre over by the Pawtucket Canal. And so the kids waiting for the bus realize the bus isn't coming. And as probably I would have done, I'm sure you probably would have done it as well. Bus isn't coming, we're going home. Free day, whatever. Anyway, these kids go home, and a number of the Cambodian kids living in the neighborhood get their fishing gear and come back to go fishing on the canal and to spend what they think is going to be a peaceful morning along the canal. And what happens is Wendy, who's one of the kids, who's 13 years old, is there fishing with his brother. And an 11-year-old white kid comes along, sees them on the canal fishing, and basically he assaults Wendy, punches him, and in the ensuing scuffle, Wendy rolls into the canal and drowns.
That's so tragic.
Rolls into the canal and drowns. And the little son, then in the first story they print, say it was a tragic accident. And however, there are witnesses, and there are people who could see what happened. And also a passing by UML student sees Wendy in the canal struggling and dives in the canal to try to save him. And so he can tell that story as well. He rescues him, but he's already drowned. And so eventually the son gets the story proper, and says what happened and that this was a scuffle, and eventually the police actually go and arrest the 11-year-old. And he's ultimately put on trial for manslaughter, and he's found guilty, and he spends a considerable amount of time in his young years in one reform school or another.
At 11 years old?
At 11 years old, yep. And the police actually go to his school and get him out of school and arrest him.
You can't really reform hate, though. Where did he learn that? He's
and
school committee and these leaders.
And again, like sort of in the to show like the depth of the unwillingness of the city to actually look at the problem. George Cole Harris, the chair of the school committee, the next day after the drowning, then after the stories become more clear as to what actually transpired, George Cole Harris is interviewed by the Lowell Sun, and essentially, in so many words, puts the blame for Wendy's death on the people that were agitating to change the schools. That if it hadn't been for them, and it hadn't been for the court filing, and it hadn't been for busing to begin to desegregate the schools, none of this ever would have happened. And so he essentially wags his finger at the state and at parents and says, basically, his death is on you.
No accountability for his racist, xenophobic rhetoric,
Nope.
or the way he mishandled this whole thing,
All
even though
along.
the state has
Yep.
been telling him, and on a federal level, so he's absolved.
Yep.
No accountability.
Yeah,
It's not
no,
my fault.
he
It's
just passes blame. He's
yeah.
got nothing
It's
to
your
do
fault
with
for
it.
wanting better for your kids.
Yep. And so
And doesn't even apologize.
no, actually, he doesn't think he has anything to apologize for.
No remorse for this young life that was lost.
Yep. Yeah, and the Lowell Sun, to its credit, after having done this story in a way that makes it not what it really was, do course correction and actually write a handful of really good stories. And again, to the Sun's credit, newspaper reporters spend a lot of time going into the schools and looking at the conditions. And so when we're doing the research for writing an article about all of this, there's really detailed descriptions of, and photographs as well, of kids sitting on the floor in a hallway, not in a classroom, things like that. So we know, and again, we were able to, I say we because one of the people working on this with me is a young woman who's a history major, whose parents came here as Cambodian refugees, and another is a former student of mine who's now working at the Institute for Asian American Studies at UMass Boston. And so they're members of the community. And I didn't want to do the research without like having people who actually are members of the community who could help me understand the community better, but also could engage in the research in a way different from me.
Right.
I mean, I'm looking at it in a certain way with all these years as a white guy historian, and they're looking at it as young people from the community.
Whose parents have gone through this.
Yeah.
Who their lives have probably
Yep.
been impacted by this.
Yep. And so again, timeline-wise, the cases filed in 1987, the city still doesn't settle. They still
Over 10 years at this
they
point.
still drag it out, and it's not until 1989
Wow.
before the city actually comes up with what the courts refer to as a consent decree. They come up with a plan that's satisfactory enough to the parents and their attorneys to say, okay. So from 1973-74 to 1989,
That is insane.
15 years, roughly.
Oh my goodness. And I just think about like my own family. I know like my mother came with she was the first to be born from Puerto Rico here in the States.
Yep.
on the mainland, right? And she was put in remedial classes because she spoke Spanish. But she's brilliant. And I wonder how different her life would be if things had been changed. And then here I am coming in. I had just been born, 88. And what would my life have looked like?
The issue of hirings and the issue of who
Yeah.
is involved at higher levels in the schools and things like that, those are still very real. Those are still very real issues. And we know how much representation matters in terms of inspiring kids to learn and understand the value and importance of education and having role models. And we'll talk a good game about the importance of role models. But yeah, okay, then we have to actually do it for all the parents, but especially for the parents who had just suffered through, as young people, the killing fields in Cambodia and refugee camps and everything connected to war in Southeast Asia, to then come here and come forward is really an incredible act of bravery and selflessness for their children.
People from all different backgrounds can come together to make such a significant change. I feel like this is a story as old as Lowell, as old as the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's very Lowell to me. So thank you, Bob, for this incredible and tragic story. We have to come together. We have to make change together for the greater good of all of us. This has been History in Lowell. Thank you for watching.